All right, so today we're really, diving into the deep end with this one. We're talking Bitcoin. Uh, More specifically, the Bitcoin white paper where it all began.
Yeah, Satoshi Nakamoto's white paper, really the foundational document of, you could say, the entire cryptocurrency movement.
And it's a wild ride, let me tell you. But before we get into the nitty-gritty, I think for our listeners who maybe haven't had the pleasure of diving into this document, we should probably start with the who before the what.
You're talking about the mystery of Satoshi themselves.
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah.
I mean, we're talking about a revolutionary idea that sent shockwaves to the world of finance, and to this day, we still don't know for sure who's behind it.
It's true. It's one of those enduring mysteries that just adds to the intrigue of the whole thing. But even without knowing the face behind the name, we can appreciate the sheer brilliance of the ideas laid out in this paper.
Absolutely. That's what we're here to do. So where do we even begin with something like this?
Well, the white paper itself starts with a problem. And it's a problem that I think a lot of us who were using the internet back in the early 2000s could relate to the limitations of online transactions.
Oh, totally. I mean, even today, it can still be a bit of a pain sometimes. So walk me through this. What were the biggest issues, before Bitcoin came along?
Well, think about it. Every time you made an online purchase, you had to trust a third party to handle the money.
Right.
Your bank, a credit card company, some kind of intermediary.
Sure, to make sure I wasn't getting scammed or, sending my hard-earned money into the void.
Exactly. But that reliance on a third party came with its own set of problems. Problems that Satoshi highlighted really effectively in the white paper.
Such as? Hit me with it.
Well, for starters, fees. Every transaction came with a fee, a cut for the middleman. And those fees could be pretty hefty, especially for smaller transactions.
Yeah, and that always felt kind of unfair, right? Like, why should I have to pay an arm and a leg just to buy a song online or something?
Exactly. It discouraged those microtransactions, which really limited the potential of online commerce, And beyond that, there were issues of speed. Traditional transactions could take days to process.
Not to mention the whole security thing.
Well,
Like, if there's a breach at my bank or with my credit card company, suddenly my information is out there. It's a bit unnerving, to say the least.
absolutely. And these were problems that, a lot of people were grappling with, but Satoshi saw them not just as obstacles, but as opportunities.
Okay, so they identified the problems.
Yeah.
What was the solution? I mean, we're talking about reimagining the entire financial system, right?
In a way, yes. Satoshi proposed a system that completely cut out the middleman. No more banks, no more credit card companies, just direct peer-to-peer electronic cash.
Hold on. That sounds like a recipe for chaos.
Mhm.
I mean, how do you prevent fraud? How do you even track transactions without someone in charge?
That's where it gets really interesting. This is where Satoshi introduced the world to the power of cryptography and this revolutionary idea of a decentralized network.
A decentralized network? Now we're talking. But maybe we should unpack that a little bit for those of us who maybe aren't quite on that level of tech savviness.
Of course. I mean, at its core, a decentralized network is just a system that isn't controlled by any single entity. Instead of having, say, a central server, the information is distributed across multiple computers, multiple nodes.
Okay, I think I'm starting to get it.
Yeah.
But how do you actually use something like that to create a secure and reliable form of digital cash?
Well, let's start by picturing a Bitcoin, not as a physical coin, but as a kind of digital token, right?
Yeah.
And each time that token is sent from one person to another, it's like adding a signature to a document.
Okay, so each transaction adds another signature to the chain. And that chain represents the history of that Bitcoin. It's actually a pretty elegant way to think about it.
It is. But there's a catch, right? Because digital information is so easy to copy, how do you prevent someone from just, duplicating their Bitcoin and spending it twice?
Ooh, yeah, that's a good point. It's like, if I could just make a copy of a dollar bill, I'd be rich. But obviously that doesn't work in the real world.
Exactly. And that problem, that's what Satoshi called the double spending problem. It was a major hurdle that any digital currency had to overcome.
So how do they solve it? I mean, this is like the foundation of the whole system, right?
Right. And this is where Satoshi introduced the world to the concept of the blockchain. It's a pretty ingenious solution, really.
Okay, so what's the blockchain? Lay it on me.
Imagine a giant public ledger, okay? But instead of being kept in one place, it's distributed across the entire network.
So every computer on the network has a copy of this ledger.
Essentially, yes. And this ledger, it keeps track of every single Bitcoin transaction that's ever been made. So going back to our digital signature analogy, Every time a Bitcoin changes hands, that transaction is added to a block.
A block of transactions,
Mhm.
okay? And these blocks are, what, chained together somehow?
You got it. Hence the name blockchain. Each block is linked to the one that came before it, creating a chronological chain of all transactions.
So even if I could tamper with one copy of the ledger, it wouldn't matter because all the other computers on the network would have the correct information, right?
Exactly. To mess with the system, you'd have to control a majority of the network's computing power, which is practically impossible. But there's more to it than just that. The real genius is how these blocks are linked together.
Okay, I'm intrigued. Tell me more.
They're linked using something called a hash function. Essentially, it's a way to take any piece of data, no matter how big or small, and turn it into a unique string of characters, like a digital fingerprint.
A fingerprint. So each block gets its own unique fingerprint.
Yes. And here's the kicker. Even a tiny change to the data, even changing a single character, will result in a completely different fingerprint.
Wow. Okay, so it's like super sensitive.
Incredibly. So now each block in the blockchain doesn't just contain a record of its own transactions, it also includes a hash or a fingerprint of the block that came before it.
So you're linking the fingerprints together.
Exactly. And because any attempt to alter a previous block would change its fingerprint, it would instantly invalidate all the blocks that follow. It creates this tamper-proof chain going all the way back to the very first block ever created.
That is so clever. It's like a self-correcting historical record that can't be messed with.
Precisely. And that's how Bitcoin, even without any central authority, ensures the integrity and security of its transactions.
This is blowing my mind a little bit. It's like this whole system is built on like mathematical trust. But who's actually in charge of creating these blocks? Who's adding them to the chain?
That's where we get to the role of miners.
Miners, like people digging for digital gold.
Well, there are definitely some parallels. Remember those hash functions, those digital fingerprints we talked about?
Yeah, how could I forget?
Finding the right hash for a block of transactions, it's not a simple calculation. It involves solving a complex mathematical puzzle.
Okay, so it's like a digital Sudoku or something.
Kind of. And the first miner to solve the puzzle gets to add their block of transactions to the blockchain.
It's like a competition, a global digital puzzle-solving race. But what's the prize? What motivates these miners to participate?
That's a great question. The white paper outlines a pretty clever incentive system. You see, when a miner successfully adds a block to the blockchain, they get rewarded with a certain number of newly created bitcoins.
So they're essentially minting new bitcoins just by solving math problems.
In a way, yes. It's called mining because it's similar to the process of mining for gold. You expend a lot of effort, in this case, computing power, and if you're lucky, you find something valuable.
Okay, that makes sense.
Yeah.
But if they keep creating new bitcoins, wouldn't that lead to, like, inflation? You know, like, wouldn't each bitcoin become less valuable if the supply keeps increasing?
That's a sharp observation, and it's something that Satoshi addressed in the white paper. To prevent runaway inflation, the reward for mining a block is designed to decrease over time.
So it gets harder and harder to mine new bitcoins.
Exactly. Every 210,000 blocks, roughly every 4 years, the reward given to miners gets cut in half. This means that the rate at which new bitcoins are created steadily decreases.
It's like a controlled release valve,
Yeah.
keeping the system in check. Wow, they really thought of everything. So who are these miners anyway? Are we talking about like tech geniuses with rooms full of computers?
Not necessarily. In the early days, you could mine Bitcoin on a regular home computer, but as the network grew, so did the difficulty of the mining process.
So it's gotten a lot more competitive.
Oh, absolutely. These days, you need specialized hardware and a lot of electricity to even stand a chance.
So it's not exactly something you can do from your basement anymore.
Well, technically you still can, but it's become much more challenging for individuals to compete with the large-scale mining operations that have emerged.
Right, because it's all about, like, processing power now, right?
Mhm.
The more computers you have, the better your chances of solving those puzzles first. It's like a digital arms race.
In a way, it is. But regardless of who's doing the mining, the important thing is that it's happening. Because without miners, the entire Bitcoin network would grind to a halt.
No miners, no transactions.
Got it.
Yeah.
This is pretty intense stuff. We've got this tamper-proof public ledger, this puzzle-solving competition, this whole system built on cryptography and decentralization. It's like something out of a science fiction novel, but it's actually happening. It is remarkable. And the thing is, it's not just about the technology, it's about the implications. What does it mean to have a financial system that isn't controlled by any single entity? a system that's open, transparent, and accessible to anyone with an internet connection. That's the real revolution here.
Okay, yeah, you're right. This goes way beyond just a new type of currency. We're talking about a fundamental shift in how we think about trust, power, and maybe even the internet itself.
Exactly. And that's something that Satoshi hinted at throughout the white paper. This idea of decentralization, it wasn't just a technical solution. It was a philosophical underpinning for a new kind of online world.
All right, so we've gone down the rabbit hole of the blockchain. We've explored the world of miners and hash functions. I'm ready to dive into this idea of decentralization. What does it really mean, and how could it change everything? Decentralization, huh? It's a word that gets thrown around a lot these days, but I'm not gonna lie, I'm still kind of wrapping my head around what it actually looks like in practice, you know?
Yeah, it's one of those things that sounds simple enough on the surface, but then you start peeling back the layers and it's like, whoa, this could change everything.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So indulge me for a second. Paint me a picture. What does a truly decentralized world actually look like?
Well, imagine a world where no single entity has all the power. No central banks controlling the flow of money, no governments dictating the rules of the game, no tech giants hoarding your data. That's the promise of decentralization.
Okay, so it's like the Wild West, but for like everything.
In a way, yeah. It's about shifting power from centralized institutions to the edges, to individuals. It's about creating systems that are more transparent, more accountable, and ultimately more equitable.
I mean, it sounds great in theory, but isn't there a risk that things could just devolve into chaos without someone steering the ship?
That's the challenge, right? And it's something that Satoshi wrestled with in the white paper. Because you're right, decentralization isn't a magic bullet. It requires a different way of thinking about trust.
So instead of trusting a bank or a government, we're trusting what?
Math.
Algorithms.
In essence, yes.
Mhm.
We're talking about systems where trust is embedded in the code itself, in the mathematics that underpin the network. It's about creating systems that are transparent by design, where everyone can see the rules and everyone has an equal stake.
Okay, I can see how that would be appealing, especially with all the concerns about data privacy and censorship these days. But how does this all tie back to Bitcoin specifically? I mean, are we really going to be paying for our coffee with Bitcoins anytime soon?
Well, that's the million-dollar question, isn't it? And to be honest, the white paper itself doesn't offer any concrete predictions. It's more of a blueprint, a starting point.
So, like, Satoshi gave us the ingredients, but it's up to us to figure out the recipe.
Exactly. And I think that's part of what makes Bitcoin so fascinating. It's still such an early stage, such a dynamic experiment.
Yeah, and like any good experiment, there's always the possibility of unexpected results. But if we go back to the source material, to the white paper, were there any clues about what Satoshi ultimately envisioned for Bitcoin?
Well, there are definitely some hints scattered throughout. Early on, for example, Satoshi talks about the inherent inefficiencies of the traditional financial system, especially for people who don't have access to traditional banking.
So suggesting that Bitcoin could be a more inclusive system?
Potentially, yes. And later on, Satoshi touches on the potential for Bitcoin to foster greater privacy and autonomy in online transactions. And this was years before data privacy became the hot-button issue it is today.
It's crazy how prescient that white paper turned out to be.
Yeah.
It's like Satoshi caught a glimpse of the future. It was just trying to give us a nudge in the right direction.
Absolutely. And whether Bitcoin itself ends up being the revolution it promised to be, or whether it's eventually superseded by something else, the ideas it embodies, decentralization, transparency, individual empowerment, those ideas are going to continue to shape the internet and the world for decades to come.
Well, there you have it, folks. We started with a simple white paper and ended up down the rabbit hole of cryptography, decentralization, and the future of, well, pretty much everything.
It's been quite a journey. But that's the thing about Satoshi and the Bitcoin white paper. It's a story that's still being written.
Absolutely. And who knows what the next chapter holds. One thing's for sure, though it's going to be an interesting ride. Until next time, keep those minds curious and keep exploring those big ideas.